why are you a historian, and what are the central questions that have occupied you throughout your career?
Well, why I'm a historian is easy to answer. It was pure accident. I had no intention of being a professional historian when I set out to do my undergraduate degree at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. I just wanted to stay on in London because it was
an exciting place.
An exciting place, both in terms of intellectual life and in terms of having fun. And so the only way I could stay on was by applying for a scholarship to do research, which I did, not expecting to get it, but I got it. And so I stayed on. And of course, once you do a PhD, then there is no alternative to becoming a historian or whatever it is that you've done your PhD in. So, having become a historian, and in the course of the PhD, I must say that I did have many ideas, reading books that existed on the subject. And my thesis was on Ashok Maurya, so there was a lot of reading, that publications that had already been available to us, a lot of reading to be done. And I was dissatisfied with the explanations that were given, and was interested in two things. One is the relationship between rulers and society at a time. What is it that has a kind of some meaning? What is the context in which people rule, and why do they rule the way they do? And then the other thing that interested me very much was that how does one examine the context? And in those days, of course, we were all very interested in social and economic history. And therefore, that was the background with which I started looking at the context.
And the central questions that have carried on from there.
And that is a central question that has carried on in the sense that I have applied it much more to social relationships and to cultural relationships. Ending up, for example, in being very almost obstinately obsessed with the idea that culture is no longer what it was in the 19th century. It is not just the explanations and the articulation, as it were, of elite groups. And you know, in the 19th century, for example, civilization was always defined in terms of philosophy and religious texts and literature and art and architecture, all of which is legitimate. I don't deny that. But the context to that is what was happening with other groups of people.
Course.
What were they writing? What were they saying? What were they making? And we've tended to leave that out. And latterly, much of my writing has been one of trying to drag that in. And it all stems from this idea that if you're doing social and economic history, you have to look at society as a whole. You cannot just restrict yourself to elite groups. When you look at society as a whole, you get a rather different picture emerging, particularly in areas, for example, of extensive self-expression like religion, beliefs, modes of worship, rituals, etc. And I find myself getting more and more interested in trying to explain how these differences arose and what they signify.
And is it possible to, explore this in early times, in ancient times? Because there aren't records, right? I mean...
Well, at a certain point, for a certain... Up to a certain point, yes, the records are limited. It's largely archaeology.
Sure.
After that, it's texts. Texts in the form of oral traditions, in the form of written works, and in the form of a very important area in early India, which has not been fully explored, inscriptions. We have a lot of inscriptions, and they do need much more careful exploration. That is one side to it, and maybe limited sources, but nevertheless sources. The other interesting thing that's happening is that in the study of ancient history, you're beginning to get other disciplines that come in and illuminate the sources to a much greater degree than before. Let me give you an example. For instance, in archaeology, there's been a lot of work that is done on looking at excavations and excavated material from the point of view of what does it tell us about the society that existed. It's not just the typology of the objects, which has been obsessive, especially in Indian archaeology, but much more asking questions about what do they tell us about society, which is, of course, very important.